Ta ilipos ni cha de yoli chi nakfjaka naben on anwations ingek bohaglicha tomale ma yento jala waye yagnet temajos jala waye ko chobet manao nabet a hechachik umaka utohon ingek unano jalet bohaglichik unti chumet manao nabek avastailik anwachik umaka utoman mon ko chobet ayino maye yagnena hechachipek nakfjaka lakik Lugyoli chipen, manavastela tomhon. Man ayod, hinanaway yet go to mote. Man hinanit ayod machalan, ayod tamish. Hinto chalish, hiwacha hang washman, he aglichik, he how much umte. Man imalalio temish, ayinamay tangan mingik, ayik, chalolalash, wachik mike then he ojabasalia, mumai, man itolit kushka daily and kocho but tachalula maya. Inuwistichik, tanginimingik, ashatapali aktik, malilichin aktik, lawalingnik, ayik, hachalamoa, matachuolamoa, walitik, omachkan, maakot, chimalatihan, shinatatlog imanhalitskitat.
Puma concolor once had no shortage of room to exist. In fact, historically, it had the greatest range of any land mammal in the Western Hemisphere. And in North America, populations of this cat stretched from coast to coast, representing either multiple subspecies or distinct populations of the same subspecies, depending on who you ask. With that huge range came a variety of names: mountain lion, cougar, puma, and panther, to name a few. But overhunting by European settlers and habitat loss eventually drove them almost entirely out of the eastern half of the United States. And by the early 1900s, only one breeding population was still recognized east of the Mississippi, the Florida panther. A group of small, isolated, rarely seen survivors that stalked the swamps and forests of South Florida, as described in the quote we started off with from Betty Osceola, a member of the Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida. But these last eastern cougars were barely holding on as urbanization ate away at the space they needed. And by the late 20th century, the Florida panther was down to just 20 to 30 individuals. Not quite endling status, but too close for comfort. Now though, there are about 200 of them. Or are there? See, to some degree, it turned out that saving the Florida panther meant expanding the definition of what it means to be one in the first place. New individuals were brought into the area that technically became panthers in Florida. But is that alone enough to make them Florida panthers? What if preserving an animal means changing it, hybridizing away whatever makes it distinct? And if a group goes extinct but its genes live on, is it really gone at all? In ancient Greek philosophy, there's a paradoxical thought experiment called the Ship of Theseus, which explores the nature of identity and how it can change over time. In the paradox, the mythical king Theseus returns to Athens from an epic adventure, and his people decide to celebrate his heroics by preserving his famous ship for future generations. Over time, as the ship aged and decayed, the Athenians started replacing parts of its structure bit by bit to preserve the vessel as a whole. While the replacement process began with just a beam here and a plank there, eventually nothing of the original ship was left. Was this still the Ship of Theseus? Or was it an entirely new boat with a distinct identity from the one that had carried the ancient king across the sea? And if it's the latter, when in the process did it lose its initial identity? When the first replacement part was added? Or when the final original part was removed? Or at some point in between? Today, Florida panthers are facing a similar identity crisis, emerging from an effort to save them. See, the last few centuries have not been kind to the Florida panther. They were once part of a single continuous cougar population that roamed throughout the southeastern United States, but a mixture of habitat loss, overhunting, and other pressures gradually reduced their range by around 95% over the 19th and 20th centuries. But in the southern tip of Florida, they've held on in small numbers, isolated for over 100 years, more than 1,000 kilometers away from any other mountain lions. Now, historically, attempts to neatly organize the various cougar populations of the Americas into different subspecies have come to wildly different conclusions. Studies have taken them from 32 distinct subspecies to 6, to most recently just 2, making the Florida panther part of just one subspecies found in North and Central America, with the second subspecies found in South America. Taxonomy is often messy and subjective, but thousands of years of adapting to their local environment, plus a century of genetic isolation, has made Florida panthers kinda different from the other mountain lion populations in North America. They tend to be darker in color and smaller on average, though with longer legs, and a pretty broad, flat skull with arched nasal bones, a possible adaptation for coping with Florida's notorious humidity. Plus, they often have a kinked tail and a patch of fur on their backs like a cowlick. These traits are common in the population due to generations of genetic isolation. Their geographic and physical distinctiveness meant that they became an iconic part of Florida's cultural identity. Adopted as the official state animal and as the namesake of one of the state's professional sports teams. From ancient figurines to modern merch, the panther's fame among the peoples of Florida has endured for over 1,000 years in some form or another, even though the panthers themselves nearly vanished. Hunting them was banned in 1958, and they were one of the first animals to be added to the Federal Endangered Species List in 1967. But it wasn't enough. Habitat fragmentation, collisions with vehicles, and increasing inbreeding meant that this final eastern population became chronically tiny, hovering at around an estimated few dozen individuals through the 70s and 80s. Things were looking so bleak that it seemed like this beloved icon might be doomed to gradually, but inevitably, fall victim to a process known in the field of conservation as inbreeding depression. Inbreeding depression is when a population's fitness, its ability to survive and reproduce, is decreased by the loss of genetic diversity. When a gene pool is small and full of closely related individuals who interbreed with each other, the chances they'll produce offspring carrying 2 copies of the same bad gene are increased. The buildup of so many harmful genes from generation upon generation of inbreeding can overwhelm a population and lead to a literal dead end. The kinked tail and cowlicked fur patch were just the beginning. Heart problems and fertility issues became common in Florida panthers too. Their odds had gotten so bad that some began to wonder if the best way to save the panthers of Florida was, like the ship of Theseus, to change them. It's a process called genetic rescue, in theory the antidote for inbreeding depression. By introducing new breeding age animals from other populations or subspecies, you can rapidly inject a bunch of new genetic variation into a small and isolated group's gene pool, saving it from falling into an extinction vortex. And in 1991, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service announced that it was hatching a plan to do just that, releasing new cougars from other populations to genetically enrich the Florida panther. Some argued that it wouldn't tackle the root cause of the Florida panther's decline, and that conservation resources should instead be focused on providing more connected and better protected habitat. As one scientist put it at the time, genetically fortified kittens will soon be loosed upon a South Florida landscape that has repeatedly demonstrated its inability to nurture them. Plus, it opened up the possibility of weird conflicts between our taxonomic and legal systems. Would introduced cougars and future hybrids be officially considered Florida panthers and have the same protections in the eyes of the law, even if their technical scientific classifications were to differ? There were also concerns that blending populations in this way could actually reduce the animal's survivability by diluting any useful adaptations that the Florida panther might have evolved for its distinctive environment. It was a desperate conservation gamble. Genetic rescue worked in theory, but it had few well-studied precedents. And it came with many long-term unknowns that threatened to forever alter the identity of the very animal we were trying to preserve. But time was running out, and the decision was made to try anyway. In 1995, 8 female cougars were introduced to South Florida from Texas. These were cats from a different kind of ecosystem over 1,000 kilometers away, and they'd been historically classified as a different subspecies. They were still the Florida panther's closest geographic and genetic relatives, though, and it's likely that the 2 populations had occasionally interbred in centuries past, so they were the best cats to provide a genetic rescue. And the Fish and Wildlife Service determined that, upon their release, the federal government would consider them and their offspring to legally qualify as Florida panthers, even if their scientific classification might be messier. Of the 8 introduced females, 5 successfully bred with local males, resulting in a generation of 20 hybrid kittens. And from there, the gradual dispersal of Texas genes through the rest of the population was set in motion. Within just 10 years, the overall Florida Panther pool contained 44% Texas Cougar DNA. In fact, surviving introduced cats had to actually be removed out of concerns that Texas DNA could soon become excessive in the Florida Panther gene pool. But today, that experimental genetic rescue seems to have paid off. The population has jumped from the low dozens to the low hundreds. Genetic variation is up relative to before, and the most visible signs of inbreeding, like the tail kinks and the cowlicks, have dropped in prevalence from over 75% of the population to around 30%. And a 2024 study found improvements in the health of the population by virtually every metric across 5 generations after the genetic rescue. But there are also signs that the boost may be starting to wear off. Since around 2016, the growth of their population size and genetic diversity has stalled, and even begun to trend back down again. The population is still dangerously small, and without the right conditions to grow further or a regular supply of new DNA, inbreeding depression can't be kept at bay for long. Some modelers have recommended that we should probably add 5 to 10 cougars from other populations every 20 to 40 years or so to prevent the small and isolated gene pool from stagnating over time. Plus, the factors that push them into decline are still holding back their population growth today. You can't genetically enrich a panther out of the way of an oncoming truck, or safely through a fragmented habitat. In 2024 alone, 28 Florida panthers were killed in vehicle collisions, which might be over 10% of the entire population. If the landscape can't support them in large numbers like it used to, genetic rescue only buys them time. Florida panthers may end up as a chronically endangered group, limited by urbanization to just a few hundred individuals max, propped up only by occasional emergency injections of diversity from outside that keep them dangling on the edge of existence. And whatever remains of the original Florida panther in the gene pool will become fainter and fainter with every genetic rescue. There are only so many conservation tricks in the book, and in the end, there's only ever one sustainable conservation solution: providing enough safe and connected habitat for an endangered species to thrive and multiply in. If we can't do that, it'll always be endangered. Nothing else really matters. Not how intensely we manage its genetics, not what legal protections we give it, and not how we choose to view its identity. There's no objective measure for deciding how many genes make a species, or even how to define species in the first place. All that really matters is whether or not we can make space for these panthers of Theseus in the modern world. Keeping them on genetic life support may be necessary to save them, but it is far from sufficient. And without addressing their ecological crisis, their identity crisis will remain the least of their worries. Endlings is filmed in the Harry Plumley studio and was made possible by hundreds of you who supported our Kickstarter. Thank you so very much. We could not have done all of this without you. We'd like to thank the National Geographic Photo Ark for their help on this episode. Finding images of these critters is not easy, so we really appreciate the ability to work with them to show these animals to you.